Okay, welcome. It looks like that participant number is stabilizing a little bit, so let's get started. I'm quite giddy to see these large numbers of people in this virtual crowd. I haven't seen so many people virtually gathered together in a long time. So welcome to the Vancouver Urban Pandemic panel this evening. What does COVID-19 mean for cities? My name is Meg Holden. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University and director of the Urban Studies Program. And I am speaking here from my home in Vancouver to your homes, whether nearby or far away. We're a large and a diverse group here tonight. We are here to talk and learn about cities and urban matters in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic from our different perspectives. And I will say that I here and many of us are gathered on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm going to be your moderator for this evening's event. And I want to start off with just a few notes about how we're going to work with this Zoom technology that probably is very familiar to many of you on the webinar tonight. So as this is a Zoom webinar, you can see our panelists here on your display screen, but as a participant, your video will not be broadcast as part of this session. There are a few choices that you have in your display about how the panelists' faces appear to you, so you can play with that on your own screen a little bit as suits you. You should note that as far as how you appear, your name does appear beside your, in the participants list. And so for your own privacy, you do have the option of changing your name, and I see some people have opted for that, which is absolutely fine. We are recording this event for broadcasting from Simon Fraser University website, so be aware of that. Now, in addition to the panelists tonight, who I'll introduce in just a moment, I wanted to also introduce a few other important people who are assisting in this webinar. One is the group from SFU Public Square, who are our co-hosts this evening. Seth Harris from SFU Public Square is leading the team to assist you with any technical matters that you have in the webinar. So you can leave a chat message to Seth and they will be able to assist if you're having technical issues, hopefully. The other important person I wanted to introduce at this point is Karen Sawatsky, the manager of the Urban Studies Program. She's going to be helping as we get into the question and answer period of the webinar. So that is who will be helping to field the questions that I hope you will enter into the Q&A dialogue box in the webinar. So just to orient you a little bit, you see in the bottom portion of your screen that there is the participant bubble. We're at 141 participants, that's great. Next to that is the Q&A bubble. So this is the place where you can click on it, and at any point, please do log your questions for any of the panelists or in relation to this topic generally at any time. Karen will be taking note of your questions, and when we get to the question and answer portion of the evening, she'll be able to help make sure that your question is answered to the extent that we're able to in the time that we have this evening. Beside the Q&A bubble is a chat window, and you can use the chat window to communicate with someone who you see and you just want to say hi to, any technical matters, any other kind of non-dialogue content related material that you want to use. So please take a look at these two options as we proceed. Because we're a large group, we aren't going to be taking audio questions this evening, just to keep things a little bit more technically manageable. So tonight is the first opportunity that we at SFU Urban Studies have taken to reflect publicly on the COVID-19 pandemic and the changes that have occurred and the changes that we think are called for and the changes that are in store for cities and for urban lives as a result of the pandemic. It is a question that we have seen subject to a great deal of speculation, analysis, interpretation in the past few months of extreme turmoil around the world. And we are going to come at it tonight in 5 different ways from the perspective of the 5 different interdisciplinary panelists. We're not suggesting that this is a complete or a perfect set. It's a place to begin the debate that we need. And we're looking forward to engaging with you in this way tonight. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn. Each of them is going to take about 10 minutes to introduce their thoughts, their perspectives, probably throw out some questions as well. After that, we will open up the dialogue and call for your questions and comments. And then at about 8:30, I'm going to ask each of the panelists again to offer us their concluding remarks, and we'll wrap up at about 9 o'clock. As I said, this is our first chance as SFU Urban Studies to reflect publicly on the implications of COVID-19 for cities. It isn't the last. So this is actually the kickoff for a year-long series of dialogues and events called Pandemonium Urban Studies and Recovering from COVID-19. These are going to start up again after tonight in September, barring another pandemic hitting that we have to respond to in the meantime. And it will be financially supported by the Initiative in Sustainable Urban Development at SFU. In this series of events, we're going to engage with interdisciplinary thinking and policy action in cities, on cities, and about cities, as well as present the demand for policy change with views from around the world and with an unapologetic policy focus on improving results here in our Vancouver region and our current long-term planning efforts at the city, regional, and strategic domain in terms of transportation and public health, as well as housing, arts, and culture. So stay tuned for more information on this larger event series. And with that, I want to dive right in. So to introduce our first panelist, I'm going to ask Noel Dyck, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology, for your remarks, Noel. And my observation to kick things off is that in those wistful days pre-pandemic, isn't it true that our societies already had plenty of inclinations toward what we're referring to daily now as social distancing? It seems to me that that showed up in worries about too much time people were spending online, not enough time face-to-face, diminishing social skills, and showing up in a festering wound of failed social trust, broken social ties, refusals of civic and democratic engagement invitations, impatience for public services, and all manner of things that one had to wait for. Has the imposition of strict stay-at-home measures in Canadian cities been a social license to go even further down this antisocial road we were traveling? And Noel, what are your observations on the new qualities of street-level community life in the pandemic? I believe you're now in Montreal, and you were in Vancouver this last season. And what do you think we should look for post-COVID?
Okay, thanks very much, Meg. And good evening or good morning, as the case may be, to folks who are listening in. What I want to focus on is what has been happening as well as what has not been happening on our streets and in urban public spaces. This is altered dramatically during the past 4 months, of course. Normal social interactions and movements within cities have been subjected to a series of emergency declarations, closures of workplaces, and the threat of exposure to COVID-19 virus through the contact with others. What all of this involves has varied considerably by country and by city. It's not yielded anything like a standard experience, even within a given city. Some of us have been able to work from home. Others including first responders, have been obliged to carry on in spite of the increased risks that they're facing. And sadly, far too many others have lost their jobs and livelihoods. Now, what all of these factors do is to make some pretty serious bars to jump over in terms of offering any general observations about the impact of COVID-19 upon street level community and urban social relationships. Things are not the same from one city to another. The lives of individual residents of a city can differ fundamentally from each other's. But what the pandemic, it seems to me, has also delivered is a real impetus for us to think about and to look more closely into a wide range of otherwise largely taken for granted everyday encounters that occur when we step out of the homes in which we have recently been sheltering in place. What awaits us once back is nonstop television and internet coverage of the pandemic. Initially, this flooded our screens with the sudden reality of almost entirely abandoned streetscapes. But before long, media coverage began to shift to at once unremarkable, but now oddly unsettling and even controversial scenes depicting a desperation to return to so-called normal social activities in public spaces. Highlighted in this type of coverage are encounters and gatherings that have appeared to fly in the face of so much of what we have been hearing and have been counseled to do or not to do in this uncertain time. Indeed, the wearing of face masks and the maintaining of 6-foot spaces between strangers have become deeply divisive issues, at least in some places. But what I've been noticing are also countless quieter social initiatives unfolding on our streets and in public places, which deserve at least as much attention, and arguably even more than do the bad news stories. What's playing out on so many streets is a spontaneous and courteous construction of inventive and practicable ways of being with one another in public places during a time of risk and uncertainty. The interactional practices being generated and displayed on our streets and in our parks are, of course, informed to some extent by what people are seeing on television and hearing from their political leaders and public health authorities. But the genius of these inconspicuous experiments in reconfiguring conventional social practices to fit entirely new circumstances reflects something more, and often indeed something rather different than what has been recommended by experts or demanded by various government officials. For instance, the use of sidewalks has in many places become a front of mind matter, with many urbanites not only taking account of the presence of other pedestrians, both by making space for one another, but also by acknowledging the other person with a nod of the head or a hand gesture, or audibly with a hi or even a thank you. A stroll through one's neighborhood may become a more social event than it was prior to COVID. Unknown persons encountered on a sidewalk can briefly but tangibly become interactional partners rather than simply strangers who ignore one another. Ironically, then, being seen to take steps to make space for the other person walking in the other direction effectively serves to lessen the social distance between us. On at least one suburban street in Metro Vancouver, neighbors have been drawn to gather on evenings to listen to a trio of musicians who sing and play 4 songs each night. The performers, who set up on a residential driveway, and members of the audience, including mothers, fathers, children, and folks of all ages, are all suitably separated but close enough to converse easily with one another. These and countless other ways of acknowledging and being with one another, whether on sidewalks, lawns, or driveways, produce reworked and COVID-appropriate ways of seeking to resolve pressing concerns. Sadly, the potential for quite different and disturbing developments also exists. There has, in fact, been a ratcheting up of anti-Asian assaults and attacks in Canada's larger cities, including in Vancouver. In Montreal, a visiting Korean academic was stabbed in daylight in an incident that did not involve an armed robbery. It is worth noting some of the apparent contrasts that have arisen within cities and provinces that have taken differing approaches in responding to the pandemic. A counterpart of the nightly musical performance I mentioned above, in fact, triggered police intervention and a threat of punishing fines in Montreal. Indeed, in Montreal, as in London, England, government leaders have encouraged members of the public to advise police of any deviation from mandatory lockdown orders. Welcome to the snitch society. Montreal police were so inundated by complaints about neighbors' indiscretions that they begged that these be reported online rather than by phone. Nonetheless, millions of dollars of fines have been issued in Quebec and Ontario. Despite that, some Montrealers, including notably singer Martha Wainwright, have opted to follow their conscience rather than their provinces' and cities' diktats. In Wainwright's case, this has involved inviting a group of Hasidic singers and musicians to perform in her weekly rooftop concert for her neighborhood. What has emerged in public practice in British Columbia is somewhat different and less subterranean, despite the fact that Canada's first major outbreak of COVID occurred in care homes on the North Shore of Metro Vancouver. The tone and length of regular provincial government COVID updates has been considerably lighter and shorter than elsewhere, as is reflected in the now well-known mantra of Bonnie Henry, BC's Chief Health Officer. She delivered this when concluding her statement of an initial official health emergency on March 17th. It was simply this: "This is our time to be kind, to be calm, and to be safe." This has become the guiding principle of BC's response to COVID. In comparison with other provinces, states, and countries, the official measures taken by this government have been less numerous, stringent, or strident than those promulgated in many other jurisdictions. The key accomplishment of that modestly stated set of principles is not, to my mind, simply the manner in which it has left space for a prudent reopening of businesses. In fact, the province never formally implemented anything like a complete shutdown of all but essential businesses and services. Many businesses closed on their own in the absence of customers. Instead, what stands out for me is the manner in which Bonnie Henry's approach has astutely left space for British Columbians to begin to work out how to rejig their lives and communities in ways that respect an agreed upon need to be kind, to be calm, to be safe. The COVID-related challenges that urbanites, governments, and experts still need to address must, to be effective, enlist all the resilience, intelligence, and goodwill that can be mustered. Rather than staking everything on the timely arrival of an effective and widely available vaccine, we might be well advised to consider how smaller but manageable changes to the ways in which we live in cities might be devised and taken on board intelligently and conscientiously. Watching closely what is and what is not working on the streets offers a modest but invaluable insight into the improvising of more socially sustainable approaches to finding our way together in these unusual times.
Thanks very much, Noel. Those are some great thoughts to start us off. We're going to move next to Peter Hall. Peter is professor of urban studies and whose research focuses on economic development primarily in cities. And one of the important urban storylines that's unfolding around the cause of the pandemic has been about supply chains and how supply chains from Wuhan, China, to production sites in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere have allowed the virus to jump scales in unprecedented ways. And then on the economic effects side of the equation, we're looking at a world of cities on a very different economic trajectory that was in place pre-pandemic. So demand for goods is shifting and the ability of markets to supply goods is also shifting. And we're preparing for more shifts. Peter, how durable are some of these shifts likely to be? And what do you see as the landscape of fixities and flows of goods in urban regions post-COVID-19?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Meg, and thanks to the organizers, and thanks to Noel for kicking us off with a really great presentation there. I'm gonna try and start with a joke. And I don't know whether this is a wise thing to do on Zoom, because I won't know whether people are laughing, but on the other hand, I won't know whether they're all just groaning. And it goes something like this. You know, in before time, we used to have these places called restaurants. Some of you should be old enough to remember them. Now, there was a restaurant once, and there was a guy in that restaurant, and he was being a real jerk. He was giving everyone a hard time. He was complaining about this and that. And he eventually started complaining about the fact that the food was late. And he said to the waiter, "Where's my chicken? Are you defrosting it back there?" And the waiter said, "Listen, in this restaurant, I can assure you that our food is the very freshest, finest quality, and I can assure you that your chicken has just hatched." Okay, so the point of that joke, I hope you're laughing somewhere in the ether. The point of that joke is that there never was and there never will be such a thing as an entirely just-in-time, seamless logistics supply chain. Everything that we consume comes from somewhere, and on the way to getting to where we want to consume it, and whoever we are is in that statement, you know, for it to get to us, it has to go through a set of processes. It has to be stored somewhere. It has to be staged. It has to be assembled. It has to be transported. And that's true for chicken in a restaurant, just as it's true for toilet paper in the stores, just as it's true for beer. And so one way to think about logistics and supply chains and their impact on the city is to think about those places, those spaces that organize those movements, that store goods in one place and that release them and distribute them in other kinds of ways. And of course, through all of those processes, work gets created and livelihoods are attached to that. And those storage places are not just warehouses, they're not just rail yards, they're not just distribution centers, they reach right down into the very fabric of the city. So the kitchen in the back of the restaurant is also a storage space of food. And the kitchen at home is also a storage space of food. And so when we're trying to think about and comprehend how something as dramatic as COVID is going to change logistics supply chains and the way they are used in the city and the way they impact and structure and frame the city, we need to sort of, in a sense, take a step back and first recognize that those supply chains and those spaces of storage and preparation and assembly and distribution, those were already shaped by the society that we live in. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that it was in North America that we invented big box stores, because we live in big houses and we drive big cars and we organize our lives in ways where it would make sense to have one of the key storage sites in our urban landscape be these vast shopping centers and big box spaces that we would visit surprisingly, with surprising regularity. Okay, so logistics and supply chains shapes the city, but those supply chains and those logistics systems are fundamentally themselves shaped by the society, the economy, the polity that we live in. We make those things as much as we receive stuff from them. And so one kind of answer to the question, what difference is COVID going to make to logistics and supply chains, is to ask, what difference is COVID going to make in the rest of our lives? Is it going to change where we live in cities? It might. It might encourage us to move away from those apartments with small kitchens because there's not space to store stuff and because we don't want to take the elevator with other people. Now that's going to change the types of distribution opportunities that we have. Are we going to want to visit the store? Maybe not quite so much. Maybe shopping centers are going to be redeveloped into parcel assembly, pickup, delivery points, with much smaller shop front space, or maybe with shop front space that's the same size, but with a whole lower percentage of the business going on in there. I don't think that we should be too quick to say that the supply chains that certainly help to organize and animate the distribution of COVID. I don't think we should be too quick to say that they have failed in what they set out to do, which is to get the goods to people. It's remarkable how few shortages there are. The much talked about and touted toilet paper story wasn't a story about the failure of supply chains. It was a story about a change in the type of toilet paper people use and where they use it. We went from using toilet paper at home, toilet paper in the office of one kind, and using toilet paper at home of a different kind. Shortages have actually been surprisingly infrequent. I also don't think we should, in terms of thinking about the long-term impacts, focus too quickly and too much on what is undeniably a very steep downturn in the economy. We don't yet know what the shape of the economic recovery is going to look like. It might be steep up, it might be a W, it might be a U. Who knows? Who knows how that's going to unfold? Rather, I think if we're looking for where the sources of change in supply chains and logistics are going to come from, is that we should look for those changes in society, for the way we organize all the other things that cause us to want those goods and services, and look for the changes that were already going on in supply chain. The fact that parcel delivery was already taking off, that apartment buildings already had to devote more physical space to parcel delivery and storage and distribution, to the fact that there already was technologically enabled food delivery services, low-wage delivery of food for people who didn't want to go and sit in restaurants, and that's a part of the business that is booming, and it's perceived to be safe. Whether it is or isn't, I have no idea. So I think those are the places where we need to look for the changes that are going to come in our lives, and perhaps not be too quick to assume that people are going to stop consuming, and certainly not once the COVID recession finally recedes. Thanks, Meg.
Thanks very much, Peter. Another insightful set of thoughts. I had not made the connection between the lack of use of toilet paper in the office with the shortage of home toilet paper. That's very interesting. Next, we're going to turn to Magali Talandier, who is a professor of urban and regional studies at the Université de Grenoble-Alpes, and she's visiting us as a visiting professor in this exceptional year in Vancouver. Globalization is a package of policies and behaviors that has taken a large share of the blame for this pandemic, and particularly in the way it has been able to spread globally so quickly and effectively. And population density has taken another big chunk of the blame. Globalization and population density, of course, also happen to be two of the hallmarks of successful cities in our day that have been concentrating human population, livelihoods, and aspirations to an unprecedented degree for this generation, leading up to this pandemic. So will the density and structure of what are considered livable cities and urban essential services and amenities be shaken up post-pandemic? Magali, I'm inviting your thoughts on the contradictions of calls to de-densify our cities post-COVID.
Okay, thank you so much, Meg, for your invitation. Thank you, of course, to the participants. So I have some slides, and I have to share my screen. Okay. I think, no, yes, I think it's good. Okay, thank you. Okay, yes, so I propose a discussion about the contradictions, of course, to de-densify our cities to face epidemics like COVID-19, of course. So first, you can see the picture. Since the beginning of the health crisis, the cities appear as a danger in terms of pandemics and also in terms of ecological pressures, social disparities, or economic balance, for example. So cities, as a mirror of our society, are highly criticized. I think that 3 points are more in particular highlighted. Density, first. Population density has been identified as a key factor in the spread of the virus. In fact, we know now that the reasons of spread are multiple and more complex than only the density aspect. The age, the quality of health services, the cultural habits, the number of people per households, the type of jobs, of course, influence the results. Second, urbanization. Urbanization destroys land and ecosystems and generates zoonosis. And third, maybe, yes, metropolis as a symbol of the globalization appears to be a driver of inequalities, exclusion, and poverty. So times are very difficult for cities with this crisis of COVID-19. In contrast, the countryside appears as a new future. It's like a refuge from the negative points of the cities. And for some rural neo-rurals, a move to rural area is synonymous with a new way of building a different lifestyle, more ecological or more frugal, for example. And many rural areas are really attractive because of residential and recreational amenities, because price for to buy a house, of course. In France, just one example, in France, 200,000 Parisians left Paris and moved to the countryside just before the lockdown. And now many authors, many experts could imagine that this migration could be definitive. And they'll talk about an urban exodus and sanitary exodus in the next months and years, facilitated, of course, by digital and teleworking culture. So in this context, a rural utopia as a new perspective emerged, calls to de-densify the cities and promote a massive urban exodus from the cities to the countryside are multiplying. So is it really a good idea? Is it really a sustainable perspective? So it's my question for this seminar. So to try to answer to this simple question, I propose that we imagine this type of scenario, the scenario of a big migration from cities to the countryside. I imagine this scenario. I have chosen the case of France because, of course, I know it, but also because the historic reference is very interesting, in fact. So there was in France a very homogeneous density of population at the end of 19th century, so just before the Industrial Revolution. As you can see on the map 1, that a large part of the country had the same density at this date, at the end of the 19th century, because people lived close to the tools of their job, and that was simply the land. The second map is the current density. So we can see, of course, the impact of the urbanization, of the agglomeration of the population in the space. And between these two maps, the population has doubled, essentially because life expectancy has doubled too. So 3/4 of this increase, of this growth of population has been concentrated only on 5% of the national land. So I recognize that it's very impressive, this density, this type of agglomeration. But today, if we would like to return to this idealized geography, this homogeneous density, like in the end of the 19th century, we should have a new projection. We should have a new scenario, and it's the map 3. So on this third map, I show the fictive variation of population to obtain a more balanced, a more homogeneous density in the case of France. So we imagine a de-densification of cities and inner suburbs, and mechanically we can see that this urban de-densification will lead to a massive return to rural areas, both in plains and in the mountains. And for just to give some examples, the rural population would double, tripling sometimes, like in the mountains. So, and of course, there are many consequences of this type of scenario. So, what would be the consequences? To seriously de-densify the cities, the countryside must be urbanized and densified. Many protected areas must be artificialized. Of course, we would have to build roads, digital and energy networks to guarantee access to education and healthcare and to employment, for example. We can imagine an increase of real estate prices in these peripheral areas, a rural gentrification, of course, and maybe an increase of inequalities. Of course, in this case, motorized mobility would be more important. So, etc. And I'm not sure that the social and ecological impact of this type of scenario will be very positive. But some people imagine this scenario like a new way, a new future for the humanity, and I think it's maybe not simple like that. So finally, with these consequences, we can imagine that cities will become very attractive again. So, however, I try to explain. So, if in the post-COVID-19, certain factors could reinforce the residential attractiveness of the countryside, is it on the hand too early to be sure of this? And in the other hand, quite risky to rejoice too quickly if these migrations become massive? To conclude, of course, urbanization has its limits. Of course, it seems difficult to combine density and sometimes well-being for the population. But I'm not sure that the urban density is really the main problem. Maybe it could be interesting to question the quality of the urban density. To avoid next crisis, economic crisis, ecological crisis, social crisis, maybe pandemics too, I think we have to change, of course, many things. I think we have to reconnect living and work spaces to increase well-being of the population, to reduce motorized mobility. It's very important to increase the place of the nature in the city, respect, of course, biodiversity. So we have to localize a part of our production of goods, services to increase economic resilience, reduce, of course, our ecological footprint, etc. For all these objectives, I think that cities, towns, countryside, big cities, little towns are linked and offer complementary resources. Binary approaches and caricatural postures about cities versus rural are not constructive for the future. I believe it's very important to think and act in terms of spatial and territorial synergies to engage, I hope, a deep and a sustainable change. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Magali, and thank you also for bringing the French picture into our discussion as well. So looking forward to digging more into that map as well that you created. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Anthony Perl, who's Professor of Urban Studies and Political Science, for his views on getting around post-COVID. It seems contradictory, but traffic congestion has been one of the best things that non-automobile transportation, bikes, walking, transit, etc., has had going for it in the past generation of urbanism, because it stripped driving of some of its appeal. But in this pandemic, here we are staring down the barrel of a tailpipe again, with public health advantages now chalked up on the side of private cars, not transit or walking, and those deserted streetscapes that Noel was referring to. So how much does the pandemic change the argument that we've been making about active transportation advantages of cities? And what are your thoughts about how we will travel within and between cities post-COVID, Anthony?
Thanks, Meg. Well, I think I see the future in two spatial dimensions and two temporal scales in the midst of our pandemic. At the spatial dimension, I think that we'll see different kinds of changes at the local mobility and global travel scales. And I think that over time, short and long-term changes will also unfold differently. I have started to think about the distinction between interruption, which is what I feel the pandemic is doing in the short term, and disruption. And I think, which is the longer term destruction of organizations and modes of life, and creating the space to replace them with something else. I think the longer the interruption lasts, the greater the disruption is likely to be. So for local mobility, I think the future will really depend on how much disruption occurs, and the more the interruption triggers disruption, I think the more new ideas and new priorities are going to be needed to adapt urban space and to reprioritize different kinds of travel. I think that changes could either enhance the equity and opportunity for social cohesion and make cities better over the long term, or they could accelerate social fragmentation and generate greater urban inequality. And it'll probably come to as no surprise to those who know me or my work that I would suggest that the automobile, the more of a role the automobile plays in future disruption in local mobility, the more fragmentation and inequality that's going to generate. But as you said, Meg, today the automobile is seen as the ultimate extension of personal protective equipment. It's the safe space outside of your home. Yet at the same time, it reduces economic, social, and ecological sustainability in cities if it will be embraced by all those who can afford it, as well as many who think they can afford it, but probably can't or won't be able to the more the economic disruption continues. I think that the alternatives, of course, for short mobility trips are active transportation, and what we're left with for the medium and longer urban scale trips is public transport. And people who, based on past pandemic experience in various countries, China in particular, that I've read about, people who have a choice will avoid crowds and conventional public transit long after the interruption is behind us, unless they can see significant changes that are put into practice. Without both policy and operational innovations, I think many public transit agencies in cities will struggle for years to come in the future. Auto use could climb along with the congestion and pollution, and let's be clear, also deaths and injuries on these busier roads. I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say that in Metro Vancouver, there could easily be more people who will die because of post-COVID motor traffic crashes and injuries than people who were taken by this virus. So the short-term adaptation of public transit, I think, requires giving people a sense that their exposure to one another is less on it. Some of that can be done with masks. Some of that can be done with less crowding. I think that the best way to do that is to increase the speed of public transit vehicles, which will also increase their capacity. I think that I've read that 15 minutes in a closed space is a threshold for virologists. I think after that point, the incidence of contagion goes up quite significantly. So I think that the goal should be to try and get as many public transit trips as possible done in 15 minutes or less. And transit agencies can do that, I think, if they start changing the way they deliver service, particularly by adding more express buses and trains that make fewer stops along the way. So for example, once upon a time, maybe someone else listening will have experienced this, I've only read about it. During Expo 86, the SkyTrain ran an express service from the waterfront station, which is where Canada Place and that pavilion was, right to Main Street Chinatown, or no, Stadium Chinatown station, and then on to Main Street. That's why there's a third platform at the Stadium Chinatown station. So we could have express service, especially through that tunnel, which has the least amount of fresh air and ventilation, to move more people more quickly on the SkyTrain. Many cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, have their rapid transit trains skip stops during rush hours, but maybe at other times of the day as well, where trains would actually get you there faster and have fewer stops. I think that on the roads, curb space needs to be repurposed into bus lanes to have more rapid buses, not just rapid bus, but rapid buses along every street with a bus route. And bus services could be reorganized so that not every bus stops every 2 or 3 blocks along the way. So on-street parking along these arterial streets really needs to become a thing of the past if public transit is going to make a comeback in the months ahead. And not only will speeding up the trip make it more reasonably appealing or not as daunting to travelers, but it will also increase capacity. The same number of trains and buses could make more trips each day, carrying people with reduced crowding if they move faster, because that gives them more time to make more trips in a given day. So the longer this pandemic continues, the greater the depth of social and spatial change is likely to be. And although those are short and medium-term measures that I've mentioned, I think longer-term policy change will be needed, especially if we get into major disruption, to redistribute space from private to public mobility. And if there's enough space left over and capacity to move people affordably exists through public transit, then there's definitely lots of opportunity to increase public space, from active transportation, from restaurant patios, and other uses of shared public space. I think once we have better alternatives to the automobile, and only when those are actually in place, then jurisdictions should seriously consider pricing the automobile's mobility in urban areas like the Lower Mainland, so that the cars can pay for the road space they consume. I think the more that the interruption extends into disruption, the more governments are going to need new revenue to pay for the kinds of social and health programs that they've been offering already, and invest in new health and social programming to carry us forward. There's lots of resources that could be generated through more rational mobility pricing once there's alternatives to the automobile. I'll quickly touch on the global scale. I think that global mobility is going to be a lot more virtual and episodic until the last wave of this pandemic is behind us. And the longer it lasts, the more permanent changes there are likely to be for global mobility that connects cities. So I think that Vancouver will still remain Canada's gateway to the Pacific Rim, but I think the ways that people travel around the Pacific Rim and other long journeys will be quite different and volatile until a COVID-19 treatment or vaccine arrives, or until the pandemic just ends of its own natural causes. I expect that we're already seeing quarantines for extended periods. I think that the only alternative to that will work during the pandemic phase is pre-clearance for international travel, which will likely depend on passing a rapid COVID-19 test before getting on a flight. I think that as a result, mass tourism is going to be depressed until there's a better way and a more certain way to know that you can get where you're going, and more importantly, get back from your holiday without being quarantined somewhere. And I think that these health precautions plus the economic disruption are going to weigh negatively on tourism. As a result, I think that huge cruise ships, huge casinos, and mega events are not going to be safe and fully subscribed until there's a way to prevent or easily treat the coronavirus. And moving around the globe cheaply, predictably, and quickly are going to be less common during this pandemic. So as a result, the prospect of aviation, for example, or cruise travel, both of which are very big in Vancouver, as perpetually growing forms of global mass transportation are likely to be cut back and truncated. And I would end by saying that I think that expanding the infrastructure for airports, cruise ports, and convention centers is likely to be a bad investment for this decade, at least. We're going to need to reconsider how we design and maybe repurpose some of those facilities in the months ahead as the interruption leads into disruption. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Lots of thoughts and practical ideas about what the future might look like to dig into. Our final panelist is Yushu Zhu, Assistant Professor of Urban Studies and Public Policy. I'm inviting you, Yushu, to offer some introductory remarks on housing and on the question of staying home and those in our cities for whom staying home is not staying safe. Just to give one example from Vancouver, and I'm sure that other examples could be cited in cities across Canada and around the world. Here in Vancouver, for over a year, we had a political impasse around what to do with an encampment of about 300 homeless individuals at Oppenheimer Park. But just about a month into the pandemic, that impasse broke, and the provincial government announced that all those people would be placed in temporary housing and empty hotels. And not just those people, but with a goal of housing all those who needed a place to be safe from contracting COVID-19, to be able to practice physical distancing safely. And promises have been made that long-term housing will be found for all the people who are relocated in that way. So this is a huge shift in policy related to those who are living with housing vulnerability and those who are least securely housed. What does this about face in our approach to housing vulnerable populations mean for how this pandemic may change the way we treat the housing crisis in our cities? Yushu?
Okay, thank you, Meg. Well, I'm very lucky to be the last one after receiving so much food for thought from other panelists. I'd like to thank all the audience here. So like Meg said, I'd like to respond to the question about housing in the pandemic, because I've been thinking about this recently. And I would like to take this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and get some feedback from the audience about what you think, how the pandemic would change or shape our thinking and approach to housing in the future. I noticed that we have some audience from outside Canada, which I didn't anticipate. That's good. That's a nice part about the social distancing, because it kind of forced us to move our conversations online so that we can engage kind of globally. So I over the past few months, like the social distancing measures and stay-home orders, I think all over the world, are essential to contain disease transmission and flatten the curve. But I say staying at home safe and healthy is not a luxury, because it probably means that you don't have to worry about getting a paycheck, making ends meet, and you have a secure and safe and comfortable place to live in. And you don't need to worry about, you have enough space to self-isolate when you get sick. And according to a recent survey, however, in Canada, which was conducted in Canada, just 1 month after the physical distancing measures were in place, about half of Canadians felt that their mental health has worsened, and 40% say that their physical health has worsened. And I'm sure many of us have been experiencing some level of stress or anxiety because of the social distancing and stay-home orders. And I would like to call your attention to people whose home may be unsafe and inadequate and unaffordable, or simply not available, just like the case of homeless, as Meg mentioned. The situation could be worse. The health outcomes of the social distancing could be worse for those people. Just to give you a sense, because I would like to specifically speak to the Canadian context, 1/3 of renters and 1/10 of owners in Metro Vancouver are in core housing need. That means housing is either unaffordable to these people, or their housing is not spacious enough for the family, or the housing or dwellings need major repairs. And this is a sizable proportion of our society. And we all know that housing matters for our well-being, in particularly in a time of a crisis. And I think the pandemic has posed more severe challenges for people living in precarious housing conditions. There are several reasons for this. First is that a long period of social staying at home means longer exposure to housing-related risk factors of health, such as poor ventilation, insufficient sunlight, crowdedness, shared spaces and facilities with other housemates or neighbors. So the longer people stay in substandard housing, the more likely they are to suffer from health problems. And also, because public transit and transportation is significantly reduced, that means reduced mobility for people with disabilities or those who do not have a car to get around for work, grocery, or healthcare. And further, for those who are financially impacted because of loss of jobs or income, they might face more severe challenges of affording their rents and mortgages. And that might cause further deepen the housing precariousness and distress. Another dimension is community building. A lot of community building programs and other community-oriented activities are canceled or significantly reduced, which could serve as important coping mechanisms of mental health issues for people who live in like social housing, for example. And the reduced opportunities for social interactions and social life might further deepen social isolation and sense of loneliness or other psychological consequences. And this is on top of the closure of parks and other public spaces. Of course, now we are seeing Canada is gradually opening up some of those public spaces and parks. And finally, because of both the physical and social connectedness, people are likely to experience boredom, stress, and anxiety, which might lead to less healthy lifestyle, such as poor eating habits, increased consumption of alcohol, and drug addiction. And this may be particularly true for those who are already dealing with mental health and addiction problems. And of course, there's like gender dimension into this, but if you're interested, we can have some conversation on that as well. And my point here is none of those problems actually are new to us. But in the past, I think it's just the pandemic just kind of exposed a lot of these problems. And my point here is when we talked about housing issues before COVID-19, we used to focus a lot more on the quantitative side of affordability or housing issues, like how much people pay for their rent and mortgage and how many affordable housing units we provide. But we seem to pay less attention to the qualitative side of affordability or housing issues, like what kind of housing we provide. Does the housing meet the needs of people? Do they serve cultivate sense of home for people? One example of addressing quantity instead of quality of housing is BC, British Columbia, our province's policy approach to increase the supply of affordable housing here in the province. Basically, that approach is basically just to convert privately owned single room occupancy to public owned instead of adding more self-contained social housing. So for people who are not familiar with Canadian context, single room occupancy is kind of single room accommodation with shared facilities with others. And according to a recent a policy report, the increased government support in BC, in our province, in recent years on affordable housing has been focused mostly on providing portable rent assistance and adding new emergency shelter beds and the purchase of existing single room occupancy. In contrast, there was a loss of independent social housing that provides more secure and better quality housing. So I think the pandemic has spotlighted these pre-existing social fractures in our housing system. And these issues might likely to persist even after the pandemic, given that we have already seen massive job losses and economic slowdown. And we could only imagine that homelessness, housing precariousness, and unaffordability could only become more prevalent if no proactive policies are in place to counter those challenges. And housing inequality and social inequality, like Anthony just said, might be reinforced post-COVID-19. On the one hand, people who are financially impacted by the pandemic might find it more difficult to afford decent housing. But on the other hand, those who are financially stable or those capital rich might find the real estate market even more attractive because of the potentially dropping housing prices and lower interest rates. And that means that the low-income population might be further marginalized in the housing sector. Actually, in Canada, in Metro Vancouver, we have already seen similarly paradoxical trends in the housing market here in the region. On the one hand, we see this the volume of home sales in the past couple of months have dropped significantly. But on the other hand, the total value of home sales have remained rather stable or even increased. And of course, the federal government and local governments have adopted a series of policies to protect renters and precarious homeowners, like the financial assistance programs and rent controls, restriction on evictions, mortgage deferral, and assistance to homeless population. Of course, these temporary measures are all welcome steps to help people deal with housing stress from the crisis, but they might help people to get by, but not get ahead. And I think the pandemic has revealed a long neglected fact that access to decent housing, not just, just shelter, is a critical component of community resilience and sustainability. And in the long term, I think we should perhaps take this opportunity to reimagine the post-COVID-19 world so that we can recalibrate the housing policies to build homes instead of just shelters for people. Those are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yushu. So we have a really fertile ground for dialogue and discussion. We are rich with ideas about opportunities and challenges for socialization in public urban space, global goods movement, the quality of density and de-densification, resettling the countryside and cities in balancing, reprioritizing different kinds of travel, including re-speeding and repurposing travel facilities and amenities, and cultivating a new sense of home and priorities within our housing system in cities. I see that our Q&A bubble is already full of questions. I'm just going to ask if any of the panelists would like to raise their hand and add any additional thoughts that they want to kick off the question period with. I'll just pause for a moment if anybody wants to add any other thoughts. Okay, then Karen, can you let us know the first question?
Sure. There are several questions here. Some of them are directed specifically to individual panelists. I was thinking actually that there's a more general question that we might start with, and then I could go to the individual ones. Sure. Okay, so there's a question here from Darren, and the question is, with the COVID situation showing how people can work from home productively, what impacts do you see to land use planning and transportation planning in a potentially more localized transportation network?
Okay, so I know that Anthony will likely have some insightful thoughts on this question, but I would ask actually for all of the panelists too, because this question of the digital workforce and the Zoom class workers or something like that, how that new group of, well, it's not really a new group of workers, but how that the digital technology becomes part of the solution, and perhaps even part of the sort of the new urban sanitation solution to a pandemic context, and which obviously does have implications in the transportation system, but in other aspects of the whole urban system as well. Maybe we could start with Anthony, and then I'll move on to other panelists for their thoughts on that question.
Sure. I think that, again, in the sort of medium term or transition to post-pandemic or excuse me, post-lockdown pandemic disruption, the idea that working from home as a permanent change is likely to happen, but maybe not every day, all week. What we're probably going to need is a 7-day-a-week city work environment where people work from home certain days, different days, to try and reduce the amount of concentration and travel all at the same time on the same day. So I could see 3- and 4-day work weeks with a split between homework on a day and travel into the city center or wherever the work location is on another day. In other words, a blending and rebalancing with at least the medium term and shorter term goal of taking the congestion off of public transportation, but also off of road facilities and also of office spaces as well. So that's my initial thought about how that could work.
Peter, do you want to take a stab at that question as well?
Sure. So a couple of things to say in response to that. First thing is to say that the digital possibilities to work at home or to work away from a fixed place have been in place for a while, and they have so they have already begun to be seen in the workplace and in work organization and in life. And so and some of the things that we're seeing there is that the digital possibilities, while they do create opportunities for connection in physical space to what you might call a home or neighborhood environment as proposed by the questioner, those absolutely can and do happen. So it's possible for people to be very tied to domestic obligations while still doing remote work, for example. That's absolutely the case. They also have two other kinds of effects, and the one is sort of the kinds of effects that connect people up to further away places, to further away centers of economic activity and power. So if it's possible to live in Hope and do work in the center of Vancouver, it's equally possible to live in Hope and do work in London. And so the local distancing from the workplace can quickly translate into further distancing, and then the local connections become very different. They might be highly localized in terms of your daily sort of home-related activities, but in terms of your economic activities might implicate you in transatlantic, trans-Pacific travel and connections instead. And then the last thing to say about digital connections is that the experimentation that we're having at the moment in digital systems is partly it's to confront the health requirements, but for employers, for owners of businesses, there are also experiments in new ways of organizing work, including the possibility of changing work relationships. And that can be very good for some people and very bad for a lot of other people. It's the same technologies that allow us to work at home and so meet domestic obligations and have a different kind of relationship to our neighbors in our neighborhood. Those are the same technologies that fragment the delivery systems and have poorly paid people bringing goods to our houses on demand. So I think we have to be cautious about saying it's one thing or the other, and certainly vigilant and open to the possibilities of how we're always trying to make sure that the end result is the city we want to live in.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, I thought you were going to go with that last point also was maybe a question that I'll put to Noel next in response to this question, and it's about how the shift towards really valorizing the opportunities of digital and remote work does open up new opportunities to surveil, and it takes away at least some of the legitimacy of saying no to that kind of surveillance. I just saw in the news today that South Korea is opening up nightclubs again, but there's a proposal to put in digital tracking on everyone who enters the door of the nightclub. it seems to make sense from a public health perspective, given the importance of case tracking. From a surveillance and civic freedoms perspective, highly objectionable. Noel, do you have any sort of thoughts you'd like to add on that, or on any other aspect of this digital workforce idea in relation to the pandemic?
Yeah, no, I think the point about monitoring and surveillance is very well taken. The other thing that it does is that it essentially does away with the conventional work week. People that I know who are working from home now for a variety of different institutions, government and otherwise, are on call. This is partly in the spirit of it being an emergency. We all have to pitch in and do things here, but it's hard to know exactly how you're going to put this genie back in the bottle again once it's out. The other thing I wanted to raise about working from home is that that has really significant implications for housing, as Yusha was talking about, but also in terms of a whole range of ancillary arrangements. I think of couples who have a couple of kids who are now at home, and both husband and wife are attempting to work from home. A school is closed, and a daycare is closed for the moment. And yet the expectations of production from both of the people who are working are still there. And it's going to take some time to track that out. The other concern is that over a period of time, once you can begin to, so to speak, outsource certain work where you don't need to have people on site any longer, there may be all sorts of less expensive solutions which come up for employers in terms of the ways in which they might arrange a whole series of things. So I don't think we're in any sense fully grasping what's at stake here. I do know, however, at least one university in Canada, which the Faculty Association is struggling with the term online education. And what they are attempting to do is say, we didn't sign up for online education. We're doing indirect instruction for the period of the pandemic. And some of those sorts of distinctions are going to go by pretty quickly in the spirit of an emergency. But I think the more that people look at this, the more they're going to see. And I think both Peter and Anthony spoke to this. There's going to be advantages to be had. And some of those advantages are certainly going to be quite unequal in terms of their impact.
Thanks. Let's move on to the next question. Karen?
Okay, there are a few questions here that are addressed to specific panelists, so I'll try and get some of those in the queue here. This one is for Magali. It says, one of your recommendations is to rethink the place of nature, preserve our biodiversity, and reduce our ecological footprint. Intuitively, this sounds like the right way forward. We need to rebuild our harmonious symbiotic relationship with nature. Can you elaborate more on how this will help us to be more resilient?
Yes, big question. No, yes. Yes, of course, it's more simple to say increase the nature, respect the biodiversity than act to do that, of course. But I think that we know we have to engage an ecological turn. So maybe we can talk about which solutions, how to increase our respect of biodiversity, reduce our mobility. So we can, of course, develop these solutions. But I would like to insist that we know the solutions. It's not simple, of course, but we have solutions to change our production, to change our type of mobility. It's a big change, of course, but I think that the solutions exist. The question is maybe more political, and it's a choice. It's a collective and political choice. But if we think about housing, architects and urban planners propose many interesting things to increase the place of the nature in the city. If we think about the economy model, we know that we can localize a part of production. It's not to imagine the end of the globalization and to start to dream a local world. No, it's not this type of a future, but we know the solutions. And now I think we have to decide if we want or not change our habits. And yes, it's a political choice. I'm not sure that we are ready to do that, but yes, it's like an invitation to think about that together.
Yeah, we've seen quite a bit about the reductions in environmental pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, but let's not forget also that the IPCC has told us that we need either a sustained economic meltdown or a coordinated international response of warlike proportions in order to keep global temperature rise under a 2-degree rise. So thinking to Anthony's comments about the difference between a disruption and longer term change, we should be looking at the moves to kickstart the economy and the rebound effect of that on any positive change that we've seen in terms of effects on urban nature, I think, too. My 2 cents. Karen, next question.
Okay, and sorry, I meant to mention that questioner's name, I believe was K.H. Cheong, so thank you for that. This question is, I'm gonna just segue a little bit just because of the climate change. We have a question from Ken Cameron for Anthony, which is, what are the implications of the scenarios you foresee from the perspective of CO2 production and climate change?
Well, that's it. All depends on the length of the interruption and the depth of the disruption. The greater both are, the more creative destruction, as the economist Schumpeter used to call it, occurs. I think the more of the, as Meg was saying, the more of the window opening for a radically different and perhaps more manageable greenhouse gas and CO2 regime emerges. But we shouldn't underestimate the costs of that. There would be an extended depression that would go on for quite some time and have really difficult social impacts in our cities and beyond. And that's why we can't all encourage people to buy a car on credit right now to protect themselves from the short-term risks of the virus, because the long-term risks for the next wave of climate crisis would be even greater as a result of that.
Thanks, Anthony. Karen, back to you.
Okay, we have a question for Yushu here, and this is from Tabinda Shah, who has typed in a number of really good questions over the course of the evening. So this one is to Yushu, and Tabinda asks, do you think foreign buyership of homes in Vancouver will begin to die down following the pandemic? And will that contribute to a decrease in housing values?
Thank you for the question. I actually see two parts in the question. First is to what extent this foreign investment or foreign buyership is contributing to the increase in housing prices in Vancouver. And the second is and how does the COVID-19 impact those foreign investors in buying homes here? So for the first question is, I would say since 2010, actually, like foreign investment does contribute a significant part into the increase in housing prices here, especially in Vancouver, compared with other parts of Canada. But since, I think some of you already know that BC has introduced this speculation tax, and Vancouver has vacancy taxes, etc., which kind of cool down this foreign investment in the local markets. And we already see the dropping housing prices, especially at the high-end markets, housing market, but not so much on the, say, those relatively affordable condos. So I'd say actually the housing crisis or housing unaffordability issues in Vancouver is kind of a systematic issues rather than like largely that cannot be largely attributed to foreign investments. So that's one thing. So we need to what I'm trying to say here is that the housing values is really depending on not only the foreign investment, but also the local market conditions like supply and demand of housing. For example, I think just today or yesterday there was a report which tells that the housing rents in Vancouver actually is dropping. Especially for the short-term rentals, and that's partly because of this COVID-19. A lot of international students and immigrants or foreign workers, they are leaving this country. So some landlords are turning this short-term rentals to long-term rentals, which makes the rental price kind of dropped in Vancouver. So it's a dynamic right now. I think it's hard to predict what would unfold in the medium or long term, in which we would just have to observe. And the second part about is how this pandemic might influence this foreign buyers' home purchase behaviors. Again, that's a big question. I don't have a good answer to that, but because some of us know that a lot of home buyers here in Vancouver have Chinese background, like meaning they might, a lot of the money or investment actually can be traced back to China. But now with the pandemic, what we see is not only how that impacts people's travel behaviors, but also it impacts this geopolitics. We already see this tension between Canada and US, and also we see this recent turmoil in Hong Kong. So that could, events that happen on the other side could impact people's behavior as well. I mean, for people who are looking for places to transfer their capital or their surplus capital or surplus money out of that territory, they might looking for anywhere that they are going to have an investment for. So it's a complicated questions, and but great questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yushu. Karen, do you think we could squeeze in one more question?
Yeah, there's a question for Peter Hall, but then there's also a really great sort of general question. I was hoping that we might have time for both.
Let's do that.
Okay, so this question is actually, I think, from one of our alumni, Martin Hansen, just like we had another member of our community, Ken Cameron, our adjunct professor and advisor, asking a question earlier. So Martin asked for Peter, how can cities create more resilient and sustainable supply chains? How important is onshoring manufacturing and local logistics to this? And a third part of the question, what role can cities play?
That's a very interesting and challenging question for a place like Vancouver, where a very high proportion of what we consume comes from elsewhere. What is I think already becoming apparent in Western Canada, and we've seen examples of it locally, is that we have practices, particularly in our local food industry, which are not very resilient and appropriate to really any context. And then the problems with them have been revealed by the virus. So we've had outbreaks of viruses at food production facilities, which tend to be the kinds of facilities that are, really bad breeding grounds for the virus. They're overscale. They're very intense in terms of the human contact that goes on in them. We're horribly over reliant on a small number of production facilities, and so there could be a task for local, regional, provincial governments to be thinking about how they preserve the spaces for those kinds of production activities. That's not going to solve the climate change impacts and the unsustainability of importing, toys and clothing from all across the world into the Lower Mainland. But certainly there are things we could and should be doing around food production, distribution, repair kinds of activities, making sure that there is safe, health-wise safe, affordable, well-located spaces for that. And so I think that a lot of the things that we do around agricultural land protection, around trying to protect a wide portfolio of industrial lands, there's nothing in the COVID crisis that has changed how important those land use functions are and how important they remain.
Karen, and then the more open question that you were referring to?
Yeah, we have, this is from an anonymous person, and they say, I'm curious to know what you all have been inspired by, either here in BC and Canada or in other areas around the globe, as it pertains to urban planning or response to COVID. There's much creativity in times of stress.
Okay, great. So let's tackle that, and let's also use this question as an opportunity for each of the panelists to offer any closing thoughts too. So we will go in the same order that we started with. So Noel, would you like to share something about what has inspired you in looking around at responses, and then any final thoughts?
Right. And what's impressed me most in British Columbia has been the very measured response, which has been taken by the provincial government and which has been picked up by municipal authorities. Vancouver was a little bit late to the game in terms of a softer approach to doing this, but it's been picked up. And I think what's particularly impressive, especially when you look over the border, is to see the degree of buy-in that has been relatively effortlessly achieved by dealing with people as being partners with government rather than recipients of government diktats. And that goes right back to the way in which you think about something like this. And our chief public health officer, Bonnie Henry, mentions when asked what was the most significant work for her. And it was a novel, The Plague, okay, in which it was that real rethinking of the way in which relationships are structured. And I think it's been, as much as anything, a form of indirect appreciation on the part of the officials of what they don't know, and some of the ways in which they might be able to fill those gaps in, not simply by looking for a new set of consultants or experts, but to be able to read the initiatives and responses which are ongoing. And that I think is one of the most impressive things I've seen. It contrasts so sharply with some of the things which are happening. And I mean, that's sort of been the thing that we haven't talked about tonight appropriately, but watching cable news from the United States is sort of like an everyday horror story in terms of what happens next and what's likely to happen. And particularly for a country like Canada, what happens there is going to impact us. The greatest source of COVID in Canada has come from south of the border. It hasn't come from elsewhere in the world. That's where it's come from. And so I think that's probably going to lead to a certain differentiation in terms of how Canadians think about this, not just looking to the usual south of the border, they have got it under control, because they most definitely do not have it under control. And the time for a little bit of independent and innovative thinking is here. So I think tracking those sorts of things is going to be especially interesting.
Thanks very much, Noel. Peter, what has inspired you?
Well, two things. The first thing I want to say is just to attach to what Noel just said. The thing that's impressed me most about the way that government, and particularly Bonnie Henry, has approached this question of the lockdown and then the opening up and so on, is that they've timed their announcements and they've framed their announcements in a way that it actually gives the public time to talk things through and to contemplate how they're going to respond. And that's actually that's a really good planning lesson as well. That's a really good urban planning lesson. It's about, you know, constructing or setting a table where people can have a conversation and think through how they're going to respond. You know, it's been a week now since they've said they're going to start opening things up, and we're still, you know, they're still very clearly communicating that things need to be worked through, and I've been so impressed with that. The supply chain thing that has been that I've really been pleased to see is a return to producer-driven, producer-directed home deliveries, and of course, that's happening with the local microbreweries, but it's happening with other local producers as well. And it does seem to be more about food than other things, because that's something we do produce locally. But home box deliveries and expansions of food boxes and similar kind of thing in the seafood sector. So direct to consumer, producer to consumer distribution systems. We seem to be finding some of those again, and that's great.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Magali, how about you?
Yes, thank you. Me, it's my opinion. It's linked with the economical problem. So I was very very disturbed by the lack of mask in Europe, the lack of respirator. Nobody imagined that it would be possible to be dependent for a simply thing like a mask, and it changed my mind about the dependence of the other country for simply things in her economy. So I try to imagine a more resilient economical model for the cities, and to increase our resilience, we have to change our logic, because our economy, the economy of the cities is based on the exportation, is based on the capacity of the cities to participate at the globalization. So it's our model. It's a strategy to develop a city now. And I think we have to change that. We have to change this logic. It's not to imagine the end of the globalization, of course, because there are many positive impacts too, but it's change our logic. Maybe the most important, maybe the driver of economical resilience, it's not the globalization or the exportation, but it's a local resources. It's to start by imagining the connection with local resources before to develop our capacity to stay connected with the other world. It's not incompatible, but it's just change our logic and change our priority about economical model for the cities. Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Magali. Anthony, what about you?
Well, I don't know how urban specific this is. It's maybe more macro, but I've been most inspired by the way in which Canada has led its response to the pandemic with our area of public sector strength, and that is the healthcare sector, not just public health, the entire health delivery system. This is Canada's crown jewel of public policy. It is the one that is the most universal of all of the social programming that we have in the country. It's the one that's most closely identified with particular Canadian identity and understanding of our community's values. And I think that has bled or diffused into some of the other policy responses, because we started with something, a threat, a crisis that we actually could manage without privatized market mechanisms reasonably well. I'm not saying it's perfect, and I'm not saying that our healthcare system is absolutely equal and fair to all, but I do think that within the public sector, it's our strongest suit, and that influenced government's reactions on social policy, on economic safety nets and cushions that were put in. We've seen political leaders who would give Scrooge a run for their money, all of a sudden sort of trying to create at least some kind of basic cushions in other provinces. And in our province, where we already had a government that was more socially progressive in the first place, I think we've done especially well. So that's inspired me. I guess we were lucky in a number of ways. And my hope going forward, again at the macro level, but I think it will make a difference in our city's future too, is if we're able to continue that trajectory that's been set by the capability and the effectiveness, relatively speaking, of our healthcare system in Canada, and continue that momentum, it could lead to things like a universal income. We're maybe halfway there already with the kinds of programming that's been put together, and the longer this disruption goes on, the greater the need for that to be extended into something more permanent would be. And that would make a big difference in our city's futures, because it would put a real floor on some of the inequalities and pathologies that could arise from more homelessness, more dispossession, more dislocation that's going on. And I think it's because we had something that worked better than many other places in the world on the health side, that we are in a position to keep going in this way. So that's my hope for going forward as well.
Thanks very much, Anthony. What about you, Yushu?
I guess what I'm most impressed in the process about all the responses to COVID-19 across the world is the cultural differences, like the cultural differences in terms of at the global level, and also the cultural differences that you observe at the local neighborhood city level. For example, on the global level, you see this very different distinctive approaches between, say, Asian countries versus North American countries or even European countries. Like in Asian country, you have this huge debate about privacy versus safety. In Asian countries, you see this very progressive application of AI and digital technology in tracing patients, tracing COVID-19 impacted persons. But here you have, here in Canada, I often hear is very much serious conversations about the privacy and safety of people and containing the disease. So, and on the ground level, at the city level, you also observe those differences and like whether to wear masks or not. And sometimes those differences turn into tensions, like cultural tensions between different cultural groups or ethnic groups. So I think that the pandemic, I hope this pandemic will kind of bring, kind of foster stronger cultural awareness in our society. Like and it will just foster more solidarity rather than increasing the social isolation and discrimination among ourselves. So that's just, yeah, my hope. I hope this pandemic could be an opportunity for us to get together rather than stay apart.
Thank you very much. That was a great question to close off with. Thank you very much for the anonymous person who raised it, and thanks, Karen, for fielding it. And I want to apologize for those whose questions we were not able to address in the time that we had this evening, but please do join us again. As I mentioned, we will be unveiling and proceeding with a whole series of Pandemonium webinars throughout the academic year that will begin in September, so throughout fall 2020 to spring 2021, in order to go deeper and perhaps more towards the practical on the ground solutions, as well as some of these bigger picture complex systems understanding topics that we just began to broach tonight. So thank you very much to all the participants. Thank you to our panelists. And I didn't get to pitch in with my 2 cents and on what I find inspiring and interesting in the response that I've seen so far. And it's not unrelated to what a number of our panelists have mentioned, but it has to do with the fact that there really is no single leader who's perceived to have all of the answers, or even a really clear sectoral answer. And so there is this sense of openness that I see within decision making and within proceeding into this quite exaggerated sense of uncertainty in the unknown that we're facing in this surprise pandemic context. And that's dangerous and bewildering, but it's also an opportunity for new forms of shared leadership, dialogue, and openness to a diversity of different types of expertise and types of understandings of what we need to know and what needs to be brought into the decision making and the consideration. So with that in mind, I hope that we can all keep the conversation going. Some have asked if this conversation will be posted for viewing afterwards. It will be. We will send out a note to all those who registered when it is available. And with that note, we will also share the way to stay in touch and to register for future events. So on behalf of SFU Urban Studies and our partners, SFU Public Square, thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening or rest of your day, depending on your time zone. Noel, what is it? Be kind, stay safe, and what's the third thing?
Be calm, be kind, stay safe.
Be calm, thank you. Be calm, be kind, stay safe. Wash your hands.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody. Good night.